In the late 1975s, a simple Pepsi bottle sitting half full in a bookshop window turned into the clue that finally pulled apart a Soviet spy ring hiding in the Pentagon's shadow for more than 3 years. No one in federal law enforcement knew it, but that everyday soda bottle was sending a message they had been trying to understand for months. When they finally figured it out, the case grew into one of the most patient and deliberate espionage hunts of the Cold War. By late 1975, the Federal Bureau of Investigation already suspected that a Soviet intelligence group was active somewhere around Washington. Nothing was solid, yet the pattern kept repeating. Classified material kept slipping out of the Department of Defense and landing in Eastern Bloc hands. Technical details for satellite communication gear, internal reviews of weapons buying programs, charts showing which officers held which security clearances. Every piece helped Soviet analysts build a clearer picture of American capabilities, slow and steady. The Washington Field Office opened a counterintelligence case in January 1976 and called it Operation Quiet Pasture. 6 agents were assigned to map out who might be stealing government secrets. For almost 2 full years, they got almost nothing for their effort. Every routine method came up empty. No strange bank activity, no suspicious travel or foreign contacts, no employee standing out from the rest. Whoever was taking the documents worked with a system so controlled and so split apart that it left almost no trace at all. After a while, some agents started to think they were chasing something that might not even be there. Then August 1978 broke the deadlock. A CIA source, whose identity stayed so protected that even the FBI team never learned it, met with their handler in a European capital. During that meeting, the source said a Soviet network in the Washington area used everyday commercial items to signal when intelligence was ready to be picked up. The item in question was a Pepsi bottle. The source admitted they did not know where the signal appeared, who placed it, or how exactly the bottle had to be arranged to show it was live rather than trash. They only knew that somewhere in the nation's capital, a Pepsi bottle could mean far more than a soft drink. When the CIA passed this to the FBI in mid-August, the reaction inside the operation was split. It was their first real lead in almost 2 years, the first detail about how the spy cell might actually communicate, but it was also painfully loose. In 1978, the Washington metro area covered hundreds of square miles, held countless neighborhoods and businesses. It was home to many hundreds of thousands of people. Trying to find one meaningful Pepsi bottle in all of that felt almost impossible, yet it was the only direction they had. Pepsi was once the drink everyone reached for in America.
Its glass bottles showed up everywhere you looked – grocery aisles, gas station coolers, park trash cans, recycling bins behind apartment buildings. With so many of them scattered across the country, the idea that a single Pepsi bottle could matter more than all the others sounded almost ridiculous. Still, that was the lead they had, and the FBI pushed ahead. They widened their search and added quiet, steady surveillance in places they believed had the best odds – blocks close to Pentagon offices, busy shopping areas where federal workers spent their days, and suburbs filled with people who held security clearances. Agents were coached to notice things that didn't sit right – bottles left in spots that looked chosen, not dropped, bottles angled or placed with too much care. But the job was huge, way bigger than the manpower they had. The longer they watched, the more it felt like they were chasing smoke. After several weeks with nothing to show for the effort, senior officials started to wonder if the CIA's tip had been off or if they themselves were reading it wrong. By late September 1978, Operation Quiet Pasture drifted back to its earlier, narrower scope. The team kept digging, but no one could say where they were supposed to aim next. Special Agent Michael Reeves had been tied to the operation from the start in early 1976. and by October 1978, the case had sunk deep into his thoughts. He was 34, with 12 years in the bureau behind him. He had handled bank jobs, tracked organized crime crews, and then moved into counterintelligence. He worked in a slow, steady way, piling up notes, returning to old reports, tracing small threads that others had dropped. On the evening of October 12, 1978, Michael and his wife Abigail Reeves were set to have dinner at a small Italian place called Angelo's, only a short drive from their home in Arlington. Arlington, Virginia, sat just beyond the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. The town looked calm on the surface. Leafy blocks, family shops, quiet corners, but life there brushed up against the country's most guarded work. People with federal jobs filled many of the houses, and the routines of government seeped into almost everything. Michael and Abigail showed up at 6:45, and the hostess guided them to a table near the front window. From there, you could see the street and the row of shops on the opposite side. While Abigail looked over the menu, Michael let his eyes wander outside. That's when he noticed the bookshop across from them. Literarium Books was one of those small, independent stores that dotted suburban strips in that era. Hand-drawn signs in the windows pushed used paperbacks, weekend readings, and meet-the-author afternoons. Nothing unusual about that. But something in the window pulled at him. Not a title, not a poster, but a single Pepsi bottle.
It sat on the right side of the display, half filled with liquid. The bottle stood straight, the label turned a bit toward the sidewalk, nestled between a handful of displayed books. It didn't look tossed there, it looked placed, and that was enough to make Reeves pause. Reeves stood on the sidewalk and watched the shop owner, a middle-aged man in a cardigan sweater, move slowly through the small interior as he wrapped up the last tasks of the day. The man lowered the front shade with practiced motions, snapped the lock into place, and stepped away from the door. But the Pepsi bottle stayed in plain view on the front display, catching what was left of the fading evening light. Reeves felt a quiet shift inside, the kind of nudge seasoned investigators notice even when nothing obvious has changed. A small detail suddenly felt like it mattered. He kept thinking about that CIA report from August, the one outlining how Pepsi bottles had been used as silent markers. He thought about how this bottle sat there like someone meant for it to be noticed, not like something a clerk forgot to move. And the timing bothered him too. The bottle appeared right as the shop was closing, as if the placement was meant for someone passing by only after the doors were shut for the night. During dinner, Reeves found himself glancing across the street again and again. The bookshop window sat in his direct line of sight, and that half-filled bottle kept catching the streetlight. It looked ordinary, but every time he saw it, a small pressure built in his chest. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe it was nothing more than a coincidence. Still, Reeves couldn't shake the sense that he was staring at something that carried weight. When dinner ended and he and Abigail walked back to their car, he scanned the street out of habit. The sidewalks were mostly empty. Nearly all the nearby businesses had shut down, and the last few people outside were folks who, like him and his wife, were just out for dinner or a drink. The quiet only made his thoughts return to that bottle. Agent Reeves slept poorly. He shifted from side to side, replaying the scene in his head, thinking about the bottle in the bookshop window and the timing that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. By 6:45 the next morning, he was already in his car, driving slowly past Literarium Books on his way to the office. The shop wouldn't open until 10, so the street sat still in the early light. A few commuters crossed toward the main roads, and a delivery truck idled 2 blocks away. Reeves eased his foot off the gas as he approached the storefront. He turned his head toward the window. The Pepsi bottle was gone. Everything else looked exactly the same as the night before. The books were arranged on the same wooden stands. The hand-lettered signs still advertised the poetry reading scheduled for the following week. Only the bottle, placed with such care the previous night,
had disappeared sometime in the last 12 hours. Reeves felt his pulse pick up. He drove straight to the FBI's Washington field office and asked for an immediate meeting with his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Robert Hensley. Reeves laid out the whole sequence while Hensley listened with the steady, patient skepticism of someone who had spent decades sorting meaningful clues from harmless noise. Hensley said the detail was interesting but easily explained. Maybe the owner had taken the bottle in. Maybe a cleaner had tossed it. Maybe it had nothing at all to do with their case. But Reeves pushed the timing again. The bottle appeared right before closing and vanished by morning. That lined up almost perfectly with what the CIA source described. Place the marker when the material is ready, remove it after pickup is confirmed. Reeves knew it could still be nothing, but the rhythm of the events matched too neatly to ignore. Hensley gave the go-ahead for limited surveillance, keeping the plan simple. 2 agents would take seats in the restaurant that night and stay there long enough to see if another bottle showed up. If it did, they would follow the situation as far as they safely could. If nothing happened, they would leave it alone and treat it as a dead end. On the evening of October 13th, 2 FBI agents, posing as a married couple out for a quiet dinner, settled into a corner table at Angelo's. From that spot, they had a clean view of literarium books across the street. They ordered a meal they barely cared about and prepared to sit for hours if needed. The bookshop looked completely normal. The owner moved around inside, shelving new arrivals, ringing up a few late customers, and doing the small tasks that came with closing out another day. At 7 o'clock, the owner turned the sign to closed and started shutting things down. The agents kept their attention on every movement, waiting for the smallest hint of the Pepsi bottle. Nothing appeared. At 7:30, the owner locked the door and walked off, leaving the shop dark and still. The FBI team talked it over and decided that seeing another drop the very next night felt unlikely. So they stretched the surveillance over several more evenings, mixing in different agents to avoid drawing attention. But every night looked the same. Ordinary customers, ordinary closing duties. No Pepsi bottle in the window, no strange behavior of any kind. By October 20th, the operation was stopped. Hensley admitted Reeves might have noticed something that mattered, but without new evidence, they couldn't keep spending time and staff on it. Michael Reeves accepted the call without complaint, but he couldn't shake the memory. The bottle stayed in his mind like a picture he couldn't erase. Its exact placement, the way it appeared and vanished so neatly. He started driving past literarium books on his own time.
Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes during lunch, sometimes after dinner when the streets were quieter. Days slid into weeks. November came, bringing colder weather, shorter daylight, and that early hint of winter settling over Arlington. Reeves kept up his small personal patrols, switching his routes and times so he wouldn't fall into a pattern. He never saw anything out of the ordinary. The window stayed empty. Then, on the evening of December 8, 1978, almost 2 full months after the first sighting, Reeves passed the shop at about 8:20. Literarian Books was already closed. The sign hung on the door, the lights inside off. And there, sitting in the front window in the exact same place and set at the exact same angle, stood a Pepsi bottle filled halfway with liquid. Reeves eased his car to the curb, half a block away, his hands tight around the wheel. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. The setup matched October too perfectly. Someone was using that bottle as a signal, and someone else was reacting to it. Reeves picked up the phone and called the FBI duty officer, gave his name, and asked for immediate contact with SAC Hensley. By about 10:30 that night, Robert Hensley had already pulled together a surveillance crew from the Washington field office, pushing everyone to move fast. Their first hurdle was simple to describe and hard to solve. They had to watch literarium books without tipping off anyone who might be using the strange signal system tied to that Pepsi bottle. The shop sat on a busy stretch of commercial street where there were almost no decent places to hide people, and any obvious FBI presence could ruin the whole effort before it even began. Hensley chose the least bad option. He put 2 agents in an unmarked Ford sedan parked a short way down the block, mixed in with a line of ordinary cars. From there, they could see the storefront, though the angle forced them to rely on tiny slivers of visibility. The darkness didn't help either. They could track the shop in a loose way, but picking up any detail was close to impossible. The hours dragged. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. The bookshop stayed dark and silent, the Pepsi bottle in the window never shifting. It felt like nothing would happen at all. But at roughly 4:55 on the morning of December 9th, something finally broke the stillness. Special Agent Thomas Crawford caught what looked like a faint movement inside the building. He lifted his binoculars at once, tightening the focus on the front window while his partner straightened up, now fully awake and scanning the same spot. They still couldn't make out who was inside. The view was too narrow and the shop's interior was almost pitch black, but they did see a weak glow flare deeper in the store, as if someone had switched on a lamp in a back room. A moment later, the Pepsi bottle vanished.
One breath, it was sitting there under the streetlight's dull shine, and the next, it was gone, pulled out of sight by whoever was inside. Crawford jotted the time in his notebook, 4:57 in the morning, and reached for the radio. Before he could speak, both agents realized the same problem at the same moment. They were watching the wrong part of the building. They had eyes on the front of literarium books, the front door, the window, the sign. But they had the zero view of the back. They couldn't see a rear entrance, couldn't see whether someone had slipped in while they were staring at the window, couldn't see if someone was leaving right then through a back alley that ran behind the whole row of shops. They were sure of only one thing. No one had touched the front door. It had stayed locked all night. Yet someone had been inside long enough to remove that bottle. That meant there was another way in, and they had completely missed it. By 6 that morning, after the team returned to the FBI field office, Hensley called an emergency meeting with the investigators. The night's results backed up Michael Reeves' suspicion. The Pepsi bottle was being used as a signal, and someone connected to literarium books was resetting it after closing hours. But the night had also exposed a serious gap in their setup. They couldn't watch only the front. They needed coverage on both sides of the building at the same time, and they had to manage it without drawing attention, or the whole operation would fall apart again. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell came up with the answer. She was one of the senior people on the team and had spent years doing quiet surveillance work, so she noticed details others skipped. Across the street from literarium books, right above a small hardware store, she spotted a second-floor apartment that looked unused. The place had no lights at night, no furniture against the windows, and no sign of anyone coming or going. If they could take that unit, they would gain a clean view of the shop's front door. And if the layout worked in their favor, they might also keep an eye on the entrance to the rear alley, even if only from an angle. In a little under 48 hours, the FBI locked down a 6-month lease for the apartment, using a shell corporation created for operations like this. The unit turned out to be tiny: 1 bedroom, a compact living room, a small kitchenette, and a cramped bathroom. Still, the location made it ideal. The front windows faced straight toward literarium books, giving an unobstructed look at the shop's main window and anyone stepping inside. The rear window caught part of the rear alley entrance, though the view was crooked and limited. By December 12, 1978, the new observation post was fully active. Agents brought in professional gear, set up cameras with long lenses on sturdy tripods, and built a system for logging every detail they saw. The space never went empty.
2 agents stayed inside at all times, working 8-hour rotations to keep a full 24-hour watch. Their instructions left no room for confusion. Watch literarium books. Record every person going in or out. Track anything unusual. And pay special attention to Pepsi bottles placed in the window. If another bottle appeared, the team was to stay alert until someone removed it, then try to figure out who that person was. The agents settled into the routine, knowing the wait could stretch on. Spy networks moved slowly, following their own timing, depending on when information became available and when it was safe to pass along. A bottle could show up the next morning or not for many weeks. Their job was simple: be ready whenever it returned. On the surface, literarium books looked like any small neighborhood shop. The owner, Ernest Caldwell, arrived each day between 9:15 and 9:30, unlocked the door, and opened at 10. Customers drifted in steadily. Locals hunting for something to read. Students from the nearby community college checking off class requirements. Rare book enthusiasts hoping for a good find. The FBI photographed every one of them and compared faces against known or suspected foreign intelligence personnel. Ernest Caldwell seemed completely ordinary. He was 63, a former teacher, and had run the store for close to 8 years. Background checks showed nothing strange. No foreign trips, no odd money patterns, no ties to diplomats, operatives, or anyone flagged by intelligence analysts. He stayed in a modest place in Arlington, kept up an old 10-year-old Chevrolet, and went to a Lutheran church every Sunday. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man who had eased into retirement and found a quiet routine he liked. Nothing about him hinted that anything beyond that simple rhythm, and the agents watching him saw the same calm pattern day after day. The surveillance ran straight through December. As Christmas neared, the whole street shifted into a brighter mood. Lights hung between the street lamps, stores filled their windows with holiday colors, and even the late shoppers moved with a slower, softer pace. Literarium books set up a seasonal display with children's stories, well-known novels, and boxed collections of poetry and essays. Still, not a single Pepsi bottle showed up. After weeks of waiting, the team began to wonder if their presence had been spotted, or if the network had switched to some new way of signaling. On January 3, 1979, a little before 6:45 in the evening, a Pepsi bottle finally appeared in the front window of Literarium Books. Special Agent David Quinn was in the observation post at that moment. As soon as he saw it, he triggered the full surveillance plan without hesitation.
He called the command post at the FBI field office, reported that the signal was active, then started taking methodical photographs of the shop, capturing the bottle's exact placement and the minute it showed up. At 7 o'clock, Ernest Caldwell closed the shop like he always did. He flipped the sign, dropped the front shade, locked the door, and walked off. The bottle stayed right where it was, easy to see and clearly meant to be noticed. This time, the FBI wasn't taking chances. They had learned from their last attempt and were ready for anything: someone removing the bottle, someone circling from the side streets, or someone slipping in from the alley. Time moved slow. 8 came and went, then 9, then 10. The street quieted as every business shut down and residents settled in for the night. The surveillance team stayed in place, cameras ready, eyes on every corner. Around 4:30 in the morning on January 4th, a car rolled into view, moving at a steady, cautious pace. It was a dark-colored sedan. Quinn raised his camera and snapped several shots while the car crept along the street, but it never stopped. It kept the same steady pace and faded into the distance. Odd, but not enough to break the team's focus. Roughly 10 minutes later, Quinn's partner at the other window confirmed movement near the alley. A man had stepped into it, a lone figure, empty-handed, moving with a clear purpose through the pre-dawn dark. The lighting was weak and the distance didn't help. All they could make out was a dark silhouette, a man dressed in dark clothes, nothing more. For about 11 minutes, nothing changed. The agents watched the front window. They watched the Pepsi bottle. They waited. Then a faint light flicked on somewhere in the back of the shop. A shadow shifted behind the pulled shade, soft and quick. And then the bottle in the window was gone. Someone inside had taken it just like before and left no trace except the empty space where the signal had been. The light went out, and in less than a minute, a man stepped out from the rear alley and headed back toward the street. This time he wasn't empty-handed. He held a small paper bag, about the size you'd use for a thin paperback. The agents watching from the observation post tried to get decent photos, hoping the dim glow from the street lamps might catch his face, but it didn't work. The distance was too much, and the darkness hid everything that mattered. All they could tell was that he was of average height and average build, wearing a dark jacket and dark pants. No clear features, no marks they could use later. A moment later, he slipped out of view, swallowed by the alley and the quiet street beyond. The FBI agents had to decide fast. They could follow him and risk blowing the entire setup, or they could stay put and protect the post they'd worked so hard to maintain. Robert Hensley had spelled it out before the operation even started. The observation point was too important to lose.
If they scared the network now, the whole thing might shut down, and the Bureau would lose its only window into a system they barely understood. So the agents held their position and watched the unknown figure drift into the early morning dark. By 6 o'clock that morning, the surveillance team had laid out the full chain of events in their notes. The signal had gone up at 6:45 the night before. The vehicle had shown up at 4:30. The unknown man had gone into the alley and later walked out with the paper bag. They now had a set of photos, none sharp enough to show a face, but enough to prove someone had come for the package. And they had proof that their guess about the signal system was right. A bottle appeared when material was ready. A bottle disappeared after someone collected it through the shop's rear door. Simple. Quiet. Easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. The surveillance confirmed the structure of the network, but it didn't reveal the person who mattered most. The courier was just a runner, someone moving parcels from one point to another. Somewhere before him was the real source, the insider with access to classified defense documents, the one betraying his own government. Robert Hensley laid out what came next. They already knew Literarium Books was the drop location. They knew the Pepsi bottles acted as signals. They knew someone always arrived after the signal appeared. What they still didn't know was who placed the material there in the first place. The Bureau shifted from watching to identifying. The team got new orders: photograph every person who walked into Literarium Books, track what they brought with them and what they left with, and look for anyone who seemed to be delivering something instead of browsing like a normal customer. At the same time, they started digging into Ernest Caldwell, the owner. His financial records showed a small business with modest income. Nothing strange. No hidden deposits or sudden spending. His phone logs held the usual calls to wholesalers, local buyers, and his daughter in Richmond. Nothing yet pointed to him as part of the network. But the team wasn't ready to rule anyone out. Nothing about the place hinted at money or links abroad. There was no sign of anything that would show why he might gamble his entire life to act as a channel for Soviet intelligence. The working idea inside the Bureau was simple. Caldwell had either been pressured or pulled in, maybe paid off or pushed through blackmail, letting his small bookshop serve as a quiet handoff point. So the watch on him carried on through January. From the post across the street, agents logged the everyday flow at Literarium Books: steady foot traffic, regulars coming and going, Ernest Caldwell handling the counter, shutting down the shop the same way each night. The team snapped photos of every face, building a slow, careful map of routines, trying to spot anything that broke the pattern.
On January 29th, the Pepsi bottle showed up again in the window at 6:50 in the evening, right before closing. That was the cue. The surveillance crew switched to the full plan, cameras running non-stop, agents already staged where they needed to be. In the dark early hours, at 4:43 in the morning, a car rolled in and someone slipped into the alley, reappearing a short time later with a paper bag once the bottle had vanished from the window. It matched the January 4th pickup almost beat for beat. And again, the Bureau held its line and refused to tail the courier, keeping the integrity of the operation intact. But now the investigators had a tighter time frame to mine for clues. They compared every person who had stopped by Literarium Books in the days leading up to the January 29th signal with everyone who'd done the same before the January 4th signal. That cross-check produced a pool of around 24 names, steady customers who turned up in more than one set of surveillance photos. Then, on February 21st, another bottle appeared. Another early morning pickup followed, and the team added that day to the growing chart. When they filtered for customers present before all three signals, January 4th, January 29th, and February 21st, the list shrank sharply to only 6 people. 3 were older women, familiar faces who browsed often but had no realistic path to sensitive government material. One was a teenager, far too young to be tied to any defense-related job. That left 2 people who matched what analysts consider possible insider risks. A man in his late 30s who always carried a briefcase and dressed like an office professional, and a woman in her mid-40s who stopped by several times with a purse or small bag. On March 14, 1979, at about 2:30 in the afternoon, the man with the briefcase walked into Literarium Books. Special Agent Quinn, stationed in the observation post, caught clear shots of him as he arrived. He stayed inside for roughly 7 minutes, then headed back out, briefcase in hand, making his way to his car parked about half a block down the street. The FBI team chose right away to shadow the suspect after he stepped out of the shop, wanting to pin down his identity and see whether he had any real tie to the classified material they were worried about. 2 agents in an unmarked car kept their distance as he drove across Arlington, trailing him steadily until he reached a quiet house on Crescent Drive in Alexandria. By 6:45 that evening, while Ernest Cordwell was getting ready to close Literarium Books, a Pepsi bottle showed up in the front window. The timing was too exact to shrug off. Only a few hours had passed since the man's visit, and already the familiar signal had been placed.
By late evening on March 14th, the FBI had a full name from property listings and motor vehicle files. The man they had followed earlier was Walter Ashford. Within the next 24 hours, the background check filled in the missing link. Ashford worked for the Department of Defense as a clerk in a Pentagon office that dealt with classified procurement files. His clearance gave him access to the same sort of documents that had somehow been landing in Soviet hands over the previous several years. The pieces started to fit together fast. His bank records showed his regular civil service income, but there were odd details too. Cash deposits that didn't match any clear source, and purchases that didn't match his usual spending pattern. Through late March and early April 1979, the FBI tightened its watch on him. Agents tracked his movements from the moment he stepped out of his house each morning until he returned at night. They noted his habits, the daily drive to the Pentagon, the short lunch breaks, and the slow ride home through traffic. They photographed every person he spoke to and every address he stepped into, scanning for even the faintest sign of contact with known or suspected foreign intelligence officers. Ashford looked, on the surface, like an ordinary man living an ordinary life. He was 41 years old, single, no kids, no girlfriend anyone could find, no noticeable social circle. He went to work, came home, picked up groceries now and then, and dropped off laundry when needed. On weekends, he sometimes watched a movie or spent an hour or two at a public library. Nothing about him was loud or odd enough to catch a stranger's eye, but the FBI had stopped expecting dramatic behavior from skilled spies. The most effective ones drifted through their days like anyone else, blending in so well that no one bothered to look twice. On April 11, 1979, at 2:17 in the afternoon, Walter Ashford walked into Literarium Books again. He had his briefcase with him, as usual. He stayed for about 8 minutes, then stepped back out onto the street. Now the FBI had to choose their next move. They could wait for the evening signal to appear in the window and then watch the overnight pickup, tracing the same pattern one more time to confirm the entire cycle of the operation. They could also move right away, before Ashford had any chance to wipe things clean, before Caldwell found a way to warn anyone in the network, and before whatever Ashford had dropped off could be gathered up and slipped quietly into Soviet hands. At FBI headquarters, Robert Hensley read the report and took a moment to think it through. They had tracked this whole setup for months. They knew its rhythm, its usual patterns, the way each step fit into the next. They had already pinned down the source. What they still lacked was solid proof, the kind that would leave no room for doubt that Walter Ashford was working as a spy. Waiting might give them more time, but it also meant they could miss their chance. Evidence could vanish, someone could run, someone else could step in. Acting now meant they still held surprise on their side. That weighed more. So Hensley made the call. The FBI would serve the arrest and search warrants right away, before any warning could go out, before any pickup could happen. They would take Ernest Caldwell into custody at the bookshop, take Walter Ashford at his home, and search both places for anything that tied them to espionage. They would also get ready to send the signal themselves the next night, using Caldwell's help if he agreed, hoping they might catch the courier too. At 5:35 in the evening on April 11, 1979, a group of FBI agents walked up to the front door. They had waited for a lone customer to leave so no one else would be inside when the arrest happened. Special Agent Robert Hensley stepped in first with his credentials out. Caldwell, standing behind the counter sorting through a stack of receipts, looked up. Confusion crossed his face as he saw several men in suits filling his doorway. Hensley stated his name and told Caldwell he was being arrested for conspiring to commit espionage against the United States. Caldwell's skin drained of color. He tried to get a few words out, but Hensley continued, giving the full Miranda warning, spelling out Caldwell's right to stay silent, his right to a lawyer, and the rest of the legal protections he was owed. Two agents headed toward the back to make sure no one else was inside and that no rear exit was being used. While Caldwell was being cuffed, others started working through the shop under the authority of the search warrant, checking for whatever Ashford had dropped off earlier that day. They combed through the area behind the counter, opened the storage closet, checked the small office in the back, and moved along the rows of shelves and displays. They took their time and covered everything. Only a few minutes passed before one agent called out from the storage closet. He had spotted a manila folder. It was photographed where it lay, then lifted out with care and opened. Inside were 4 pages of photocopied material. The agents saw right away that the pages carried classification markings. The word "confidential" was stamped in red at the top and bottom of each page, and 2 of the sheets were marked "secret." A brief look at the material showed that the papers tied to satellite communication systems being developed by the Department of Defense held far more weight than they first seemed. These were technical details, evaluations, and internal program notes that any Soviet military strategist would have wanted, since they offered a clearer picture of how the United States gathered intelligence and how those methods might be challenged.
By 6 o'clock that evening, as agents wrapped up the review of the Literarian books, the FBI carried out a coordinated arrest at Walter Ashford's home on Crescent Drive. 6 agents moved in together, watching the lit windows and spotting Ashford's car waiting in the driveway, which told them he was likely inside. They knocked hard on the front door, announced themselves as federal officers, and waited. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then they heard shuffling inside. The door eased open, and Ashford stepped into view, still wearing the same business clothes he had had on earlier at work. The look on his face shifted fast once he counted the agents standing there. When the lead agent stated that he was being arrested for offenses tied to espionage and began moving into the house, Ashford tried to slam the door shut, more out of instinct than any real plan. But the team had already prepared for that, bracing the entry so he couldn't close it. Within a handful of seconds, they had him under control, handcuffed, and listening to his Miranda rights in his own living room, while the rest of the team started carrying out the search warrant across the house. The search turned up more than anyone expected. In a bedroom closet, tucked inside a shoebox under several other boxes, agents found a Minox camera, the small spy camera long linked to Cold War tradecraft. It fit easily in a pocket and was built for fast, quiet shots of sensitive papers. Right beside it were several rolls of exposed film that had never been developed. In the home office, agents opened a desk drawer and uncovered a spiral-bound notebook filled with what looked like coded notes. The pages showed dates, short labels, and strings of what seemed like meaningless numbers. Later, counterintelligence analysts would piece together that the notebook likely tracked which items had been photographed, passed along, or tied to certain payments. The notebook became a key part of the case, showing that Ashford's actions were not impulsive but organized and repeated over a long stretch of time. Both Ernest Caldwell and Walter Ashford were taken separately to the FBI's Washington field office. Each man was placed in a different interview room, kept apart to avoid any exchange of information. Before any agents began their questions, both were told their rights and processed according to standard procedure, setting the stage for the long interrogations that would follow. The FBI tried to use the evidence they already had to push for cooperation. They focused on Caldwell because he seemed more like a helper than the main figure in the espionage chain. They also believed he might talk if he thought it could help him when the court decided his sentence. Ernest Caldwell was clearly shaken after the arrest. The weight of the charges left him rattled, and he asked for a lawyer right away.
A lawyer arrived in about 2 hours, met with him in private, and told him straight that cooperating was his best chance to limit the damage. Caldwell agreed. That evening, on April 11th, over the course of several hours and then into the early morning of April 12th, he gave investigators a full account of what he had done. He went step by step through how he first became involved and how things had grown from there. He said the whole thing had started about 3 years earlier, sometime in early 1976, when a man calling himself only Michael walked into his life. This man had shown up in the bookshop looking like any regular customer. He was well-dressed, acted confident, and spoke in a calm, professional way. He came back several times over the next few weeks. Each visit felt casual at first, just small talk in the aisles, until he finally made his pitch. Michael told him he would pay him $500 in cash each month. In return, Caldwell would let the shop serve as a place for what Michael described as quiet exchanges of business papers. Michael said he worked with corporate clients who needed to pass sensitive information without drawing attention. He claimed the bookshop, with its slow pace and its reputation in the neighborhood, was the perfect neutral spot. Caldwell told investigators he knew something about the offer was off. He suspected it might involve illegal business intelligence work, but he said he never imagined it had anything to do with classified government files or Soviet contacts. Still, the money mattered. $500 a month, in cash, was a big help for a small shop trying to stay steady on thin margins. And the system Michael described sounded simple and low effort. If someone dropped something off, Caldwell was supposed to place a Pepsi bottle in the front window before closing. The bottle was filled halfway with soda and set on the right side of the window, tilted a little toward the street. That was the signal that the material was ready to be picked up. Michael had also given Caldwell a key meant for the person who handled the pickups. That person would come through the back door late at night after the shop was dark, take whatever had been left, and slip out the same way. Caldwell said his only role was to make the drop possible and send the signal. He was not to look at anything, not to ask what was being moved, and not to get involved beyond placing the bottle and making sure the back door could be used. He framed his part as mechanical and detached, a routine he followed without understanding the full extent of what he was helping pass from one set of hands to another. Caldwell talked about the rare moments when he had actually caught sight of the courier, the person who came to collect the material, or at least one of the people who handled those pickups.
Over roughly 3 years, he said it had happened only 3 or 4 times, and each instance had been more accidental than planned. Now and then the courier seemed to decide, for reasons Caldwell could only guess at, to walk in through the front door during regular hours instead of slipping in through the back late at night. Maybe the man wanted to change his routine, or maybe something about the rear entrance looked risky on those particular nights. Even when Caldwell tried to recall details, his memories stayed thin and unsatisfying. He remembered a white man of medium height and build, likely somewhere between 35 and 45 years old. Dark hair cut short, clean-shaven, no scars, tattoos, or anything else that stuck in Caldwell's mind. The courier never spoke to him, never lingered, never made small talk. He would take the packet, turn, and walk out. Caldwell had never learned the man's name, never knew where he lived, and had no sense of who he was beyond those simple physical traits. When FBI investigators brought up Walter Ashford, Caldwell confirmed that Ashford had been the one bringing material into the shop throughout the 3-year span of the operation. He explained that he had never known Ashford's name until agents told him during the interview. Their exchanges at the shop had always stayed superficial, brief comments about books, nothing more. Ashford would come in, hand over the material with almost no conversation, and leave. Caldwell would store the packet in the closet, put out the signal before closing, and sometime during the night the pickup would happen. He had no firm count of how many times Ashford had made these drops. His memory wavered, but he believed it had been at least a dozen occasions over 2 or 3 years. Ashford, meanwhile, reacted very differently when questioned on the evening of April 11th. After being advised of his rights, he flatly denied any involvement in espionage. He denied passing classified files. He denied having even the slightest link to Soviet intelligence. When agents presented the documents recovered from the bookshop, the same documents already traced back to his Pentagon office, Ashford insisted he had no idea how they had ended up there. He said someone must be trying to frame him, that he had only visited the shop to buy a book and had nothing to do with any sensitive material. When investigators followed up with the items found in his home, a Minox camera, undeveloped film, and a notebook filled with coded notes, Ashford's explanations grew even thinner. He said the camera had been a gift. He said he used it for casual photography. He claimed he knew nothing about codes, secret work, or any sort of intelligence activity. But as the questioning went on and the evidence became harder to brush aside, Ashford finally invoked his right to remain silent and asked for an attorney.
From that moment on, he shut down completely, refused every question, and offered no help whatsoever to the investigation. With Ernest Caldwell already in custody and willing to help, the FBI finally had a clean chance to figure out who the courier was and catch him at the moment he came for the pickup. The idea was simple on the surface, but needed steady, precise execution. They would use Caldwell's cooperation to set out the Pepsi bottle signal in the front window exactly the same way it would appear after a real drop. Then FBI agents would hide inside literarium books overnight and grab whoever came in expecting fresh material. If the courier kept to his usual routine and showed up in the early hours, he would walk into the shop thinking everything was normal and instead find federal agents waiting for him. On the evening of April 12, 1979, close to 24 hours after the earlier arrests, FBI agents began putting the plan together. They checked each detail, wanting the scene to look identical to any other day when Caldwell had left a signal. At 6:45 that evening, Caldwell placed the Pepsi bottle in the front window of Literarium Books, setting it on the right side and angling it toward the street, just as he had done in earlier exchanges.
From the sidewalk, nothing looked unusual. The store's exterior stayed as it always did after closing. Lights off, shade pulled down. No sign that anyone was inside or anything was out of place. Inside the dim shop, 4 FBI agents settled into hidden spots. 2 agents squeezed behind the tall shelves along the back wall, where they could watch both the front door and the usual drop location without being seen. A 3rd agent tucked himself into the storage closet where the earlier documents had been discovered, staying pressed into the shadows. The 4th waited in the small office near the rear entrance, ready to act if the courier chose to slip in through the back instead of the front. All of them carried weapons. All of them had the same instructions: stay hidden, let the courier walk in, let him move toward the pickup spot, then step out, announce themselves as federal agents, and take him into custody. The trap was ready. Nothing left but the long wait. Time moved slowly inside the dark shop. Every tiny sound felt louder than it was: an occasional creak from the old building, the muffled hum of cars drifting past on the street. Midnight came, then 1:30. 1 in the morning slid by, then 2. The agent stayed in place, stiff and uncomfortable, but refusing to shift even an inch more than needed. Any movement or whisper could ruin everything. They stayed still, breathing quietly, watching the door that never opened. 3 in the morning passed, then 4. By 4:30, the hour when earlier pickups had almost always happened, the shop was still silent. No headlights slowed outside, no shadow crossed the alley, no click of a key in the back door.
The place stayed empty, except for the agents sitting in the dark, listening to nothing and wondering if the courier had sensed the risk or simply changed his routine. By 6:30, with dawn washing a pale light through the edges of the window shade and the first morning cars rolling along the street, it was clear the courier wasn't coming. The operation had waited through the entire night, but the person they hoped to catch never appeared. The FBI team kept their watch going through the morning and well into the afternoon of April 13th, holding their positions in the shop and staying out of sight in case the courier showed up while it was still light. But nothing changed. No one came. By that point, it seemed likely that the courier either guessed the arrests had happened or sensed that the signal was wrong. It was also possible that the network used some extra cue the FBI still hadn't figured out, some quiet way to verify that a drop was real before anyone took the risk of walking in. Maybe there was a second signal Ernest Caldwell never mentioned or never knew about. Maybe the courier had tried reaching him through some other path and backed off the moment Caldwell failed to answer. Or maybe Soviet intelligence had already caught wind of Walter Ashford's arrest and pushed an immediate shutdown of all activity, telling their people to stay away from anything that looked like an established dead drop. When Robert Hensley sat down with his team later that afternoon on April 13th, he didn't hide the disappointment. Still, he understood the limits of the operation and what they had actually managed to achieve. They had taken the source off the board, a man who had handed out protected material for several years. They had closed a drop site that had handled many successful exchanges. They had collected classified papers along with other proof showing a steady pattern of espionage. Yes, the courier had slipped away, but the network was now damaged in a real way. With the bookshop no longer usable, and with Walter Ashford unable to supply anything new, the Soviet effort in that part of the country had taken a heavy hit. The case against Ashford moved ahead in the federal system at the slow, steady pace that espionage trials usually follow. Prosecutors from the Department of Justice's Internal Security Section spent months shaping a full record: surveillance reports, the items taken from the bookshop and from Ashford's home, Ernest Caldwell's testimony, and the damage assessment from Department of Defense analysts. That assessment concluded that Ashford had likely leaked several dozen restricted documents over roughly 3 years,
starting around 1976. Most of the material dealt with satellite communications and military procurement, exactly the type of information Soviet planners studied to read American strengths and design ways to counter them.
Ashford's trial opened in October 1979 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. His lawyer pushed back hard, saying the whole case hinged on indirect proof, claiming anyone could have planted the files in the shop, insisting the camera at Ashford's home was for normal personal use, and arguing the government still had no clear proof that Ashford meant to hand sensitive information to a foreign service. The prosecution's case came across as steady and hard to dispute. The surveillance photos didn't just place Ashford near the scene, they caught him walking straight into the bookshop, giving the jury a simple image to hold on to. The folder recovered inside that same shop carried papers traced back to his office in the Pentagon. These were files he could reach whenever he wanted, and the markings on them made it obvious they belonged to his division. The Minox camera and the rolls of unused film pulled from his home fit the pattern that intelligence agents had used for years, so investigators saw them as another piece of a much bigger routine. The notebook filled with coded notes hinted at a habit that had gone on for a long time, with entries that looked like someone carefully tracking each step of his work. Ernest Caldwell took the stand for the prosecution under his cooperation deal and laid out how the drop site worked. He stated plainly that Walter Ashford had been the only person he ever saw bringing packets to the bookshop and that it had happened more than once. His words hit hard. They walked the jury through the way the whole espionage setup functioned and showed exactly where Ashford fit inside that structure. By the time Caldwell finished, the picture of the network felt more complete and far bleaker for the defense. On November 8, 1979, after 6 hours of discussion, the jury delivered a guilty verdict on every charge. That included conspiracy to commit espionage, unlawful possession and transmission of classified material, and a group of connected offenses. Ashford didn't show any emotion at all when the decision was announced, keeping the same blank expression he had for most of the trial. Sentencing came in January 1980. The federal judge pointed to the gravity of the crimes and the harm done to national security, then handed down a sentence of 25 years in a federal prison. Caldwell, whose role had been smaller and who had helped investigators, received 5 years with the chance of parole after serving 2. Still, big questions hung in the air. No one had figured out who first brought Ashford into the operation, or who the courier was, or how wide the Soviet network truly reached. The FBI kept working for months after the trial.
Agents sifted through surveillance photos, compared Caldwell's loose description of the courier with files on known intelligence officers, and tried to match any detail with suspects already flagged in older investigations. But without a solid image of the courier, without Ashford saying a word, and without fresh leads appearing, the search stalled. Whoever the man was, he had slipped past the FBI's efforts and returned to whatever identity he used in daily life. He might have kept working for Soviet intelligence somewhere else or gone back to the Soviet Union once the network collapsed. The case stayed partly classified for many years. The Department of Defense pushed to keep sections sealed so no one could see how much had been compromised or what capabilities had been exposed. For Michael Rees, the agent who first noticed something odd during a simple dinner and sparked the entire breakthrough, the case marked both a high point in his career and a quiet reminder that small details can change the course of counterintelligence work. In the years that followed, once parts of the case were finally released to the public, people kept asking Reeves about that night at Angelo's restaurant. They wanted to know why he stopped to look at the Pepsi bottle when countless others had passed the same bookshop window and never thought twice about it. His reply never changed much. He said it wasn't brilliance, and it wasn't some sudden spark of intuition. It was more basic than that. He had trained himself to watch for patterns, to notice small breaks in routine, and to pay attention when something felt even a little off. And instead of brushing it aside as random chance, which would have been the convenient thing to do, he chose to dig in and check. That simple habit, he said, mattered far more than any dramatic insight people liked to imagine.